Sounds pretty good. And I think you're also in a good room that's good for recording anyways. Enough talking about production stuff. Welcome to the show, Mujamma. It's good to meet you. We've been texting a little bit or DMing a little bit. I'm a big fan of your work, huge fan of your work. I'm hoping with this episode, some more people get introduced to your work. I think it's critical, as you will see, as you'll all learn over the course of this next interview. Mujamma is very knowledgeable about the history of the resistance. He has a deep knowledge of many of the figures, translated a lot of original text, important texts. And I was saying this before we started, but I feel like this is exemplary kind of work that people with the language skills should be doing, providing a kind of providing a kind of tunnel, let's say, a civilizational tunnel, a linguistic tunnel between us and the resistance, because we know that it's so, and its histories, which is to say to learn about them, because they can't, as much as they prescribe these groups or whatever, make you out to be a terrorist, like it's not illegal to learn and study. And these are important historical figures. And you're effectively like breaking, sorry, I have an air compressor on in my house. We're all going to have to suffer through this. And you're effectively like breaking a taboo, which I think, or like breaking a siege, a kind of information siege by illuminating this figure. So I'm done boosting your work. I'm sure you're going to do that yourself, people in your own thing, just by showing how much you know about this stuff. So this is a big pleasure for me, and I get to learn a lot from you. Would you like to introduce yourself a little bit, talk a little bit about your interests?
Yes, thank you very much for having me. My sobriquet that I go by is Mujamma Harakat. The name itself draws from the Mujamma network, which was a Dawah network inaugurated by Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, who was one of the formative, if not the spearheading figure of Hamas, and before that of the Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood's Dawah nexus. It should be noted that there were competing factions within the Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood, but Ahmed Yassin represented, after a significant mosque building phase, the facet of resistance. I have been researching the history of the Islamic resistance, specifically in Palestine, but more broadly as well in what is known as the so-called axis of resistance, for quite some time. More broadly, my research in my academic writing is on non-state actors. My area of concentration since 2020, 2021 in particular, has been on the witness accounts of Hamas, particularly texts that were written by members of the Qassam brigades, and also texts that were written by political bureau members associated with the Qassam brigades. I've translated also a number of prison texts and published these, getting permission from those who have the rights in some instances, but in most instances this has not been required because these texts were themselves distributed with guerrilla modalities, so to speak, not under publishing houses, with the exception of one publisher called Palestine al-Muslima, which was the publishing arm of Hamas. It didn't only publish Hamas texts, it also published texts by an author and political scientist, a Palestinian activist named Khazan Douar. His texts have been some of the most important. Hamas scholars like Khalid Hurub and Azam Tamimi, Leila Sorat, Sarah Roy even, they have drawn quite a bit on some of the texts that he produced, but none have ever been translated into English. So this has been an ambition of mine, starting with his authoritative biography of Imadako. So I think this is a good beginning.
This is excellent. This is excellent. I'm really jazzed for this episode. I'm excited. I feel like these episodes are the reason I do this podcast. Is the reason we should have these podcasts exist, is to learn about these figures and who they are. because as you pointed out, like these are human beings. These are regular human beings who did extraordinary historical work that stands out, that it's important to recognize and think about their contributions to a larger national movement in historical terms, in critical terms, in scholarly terms. And we shouldn't be afraid to talk about this stuff. Which, all that being said, I think we're at a stage now. Obviously, the most recent big name announcement of martyrdom is Abu Ubaidah. Abu Ubaidah is the well-known speaker of the Al-Qassam Brigade, which is the military, the Izzuddin Al-Qassam Brigade, which is the military wing of the Hamas movement. And Abu Ubaidah, well, the current speaker is also Abu Ubaidah, but the Abu Ubaidah that became famous for the last, 25 years, 20 years, more, I think, maybe. I don't know. I can't tell now. But yeah, no, 20 years. And that with his passing, there seems to be, at least, and maybe you can correct me, but a kind of the generation of men that brought about Al-Aqsa Flood, October 7th, most of them have been martyred. Not all, but most of them have been martyred. And the leadership that brought people to that point has also been martyred, the political leadership, which is to say, a lot of it. There are a few notable exceptions, and we'll talk about them. So in these moments, my academic training kicks in, my literary training kicks in, and I can't help but sort of be tempted to think about these almost ridiculous now, if you think about it, these kind of models we have of plot implotment, of sort of imploding narrative structures, which is to say there's kind of a beginning point, an origin story, and then there's kind of what's called a rising action, which is a kind of a ratcheting up of tensions, and that reaches a point that we call like a climax, or some kind of, some maximum height of tension or whatever. And then afterwards, there's the period where people reflect on what's occurred, where they take stock of it, and it's typically called a kind of denouement. And this, for a lot of people, even though it's this really silly, old leftover thing from like 19th century theater criticism, it's like a German guy, Gustav Freytag. I always laughed at this, but it's still taught. It's still kind of envisioned this way. And a lot of stuff actually you can tell that's like made today is imploded to that, because they've imbibed so many of these kinds of stories. So all of this is to say that, as arbitrary as this kind of implotment is, can we think about this moment where we're looking at so many martyr leaders as a kind of denouement of this class of resistors, this generation of resistors? This is not to say that Palestinians are not resisting anymore and Al-Qassam brigades is some sort of retired, but it seems to me, at least, that many of the men that took us to here are now gone. And so I was wondering from the outset, given your knowledge, and obviously the kind of characters that the big name characters we can discuss, but at the outset, I'm wondering if you think that's fair to sort of actually do that, to put that against that implotment. If you think that it's not, that the confrontation is still to come, the climax is still to come, which is crazy thing to thought, or we could just throw this model out entirely. But at least to me, it's a familiar way of implotment, because Al-Aqsa Flood represents a kind of climax of a certain kind of liberation, like, let's say, fighting, or let's say of an expression of the military logic of the liberation of Palestine. It is a kind of climax, in a sense, of a certain model of resistance. So I'm curious, though, if you think that's a fair thing to sort of postulate, and if there was something sort of alternative, and if you think it is fair, or at least it's useful as a thought experiment, maybe you can begin by starting with what you think are the sort of the origin points, where we would be on the kind of bottom point of that graph.
Certainly. So I think it is one inflection point in the history of many inflection points. Many thought that in
You mean Al-Aqsa Flood? Al-Aqsa Flood, you mean? Or
I mean the current
point?
moment.
Okay.
The moment that you underscored, that of which a significant facet of both the political bureau leadership, Ismail Haniyeh, Yahya Sinwar, others as well, but also of the formative Al-Qassam Brigade's leadership, have been martyred. This is one inflection point in a history of inflection points. Many posited that towards the end of the Second Intifada, when Ahmed Yassin was martyred on the 22nd of March in 2004, and a number of the most formative political bureau leaders who were based in Gaza at the time were arrested, that this too was a denouement of sorts. At that point, Abu Marzouk, who was living in the United States, trekked to Palestine and helped reorganize the political bureau in a more clandestine fashion that focused on mosque building, dawah, civil and social institutions ranging from kindergartens, education, medical institutions, many of which were at very low cost, if not entirely free, and were relegated broadly to the poorer facets of Palestinian life, part of what some scholars like Sarah Roy refer to as the Islamic State social institution ISI building phase. And I think that it very well may be the case that in subsequent years, this was actually, by the way, the second time that the Islamic Resistance Movement had turned towards the dawah, social and civil services as its main focus. It may again transpire. This may again be the direction that the movement focuses towards. But at the same time, we also have a number of very important leaders within Al-Qassam who are still alive, who are part of the Al-Sinwar generation and mentality. The biggest name is Izz al-Din al-Haddad, whom the Zionist entity has, with its Shabak, its Shin Bet, been trying to martyr for many years and has been unsuccessful. And within the political bureau, you have number of figures who are also representative of the Al-Sinwar ethos. Many oftentimes believe that it is Khalid Mashal who is representative of the political bureau. This is not correct. Since 2017, he has broadly been sidelined from the decision-making capacity. This was a very important internal election in 2017, which saw the rise of Al-Sinwar to the Gaza Political Bureau Division's head, as well as Ismail Haniyeh to the general representative of the so-called Executive Council of Hamas. But you have, most importantly, Khalil al-Haya, who is leading the political bureau. And he is very much representative, along with a number of other very important members like Zahir Jabarin, who undersees the prisoners file of Hamas, of the executive committee in general, and of the Hamas movement more broadly, of the executive committee specifically, and of the Hamas movement more broadly. I would also want to note that there's an acting executive committee currently within the political bureau. Instead of having one leader, like Ismail Haniyeh was, and after that Al-Sinwar was, there are 5 leaders. So the acting committee is comprised of Mohammed Darwish, who acts as the body's head or coordinator, alongside Al-Haya, Khalid Mashal, Zahir Jabarin, and Nizar Awadallah. Now, Mashal is part of it. He's representative of...
For 1 second. Sorry. These guys are all in Qatar.
No, they're not all just based Mashal? In Qatar. Not just Mashal. Haya is usually in Qatar. Jabarin is not in Qatar. He sometimes is in Qatar again, but he is more often in Turkey. And then you have some members who are in Egypt. The thinking is that after the political bureau left Syria, Damascus, in 2012, they all came to Qatar. This is not exactly true. Members like Marzouk went to Egypt. Other members went to Turkey. Some stayed longer in Syria. Not those who were part of the executive committee, but those who were still part of the political bureau. And to this day, there is not one location in which all of the Hamas political bureau is based. Yes, they all meet in Qatar often for purposes of delegation and for the ongoing, and it is still, of course, ongoing debates about what position should be taken, internal elections and the like, but it is not the only geographical nexus. So we can continue with the history if you like, but I don't want to speak for too long without you also
Go
giving
ahead.
your
You
position.
can speak as long as you want, brother. It's okay. This is good stuff.
I would also want to note, by the way, when speaking of the history, we mentioned Khaled Mishal. Perhaps some listeners would be curious why mention Khaled Mishal. He's representative of the so-called more pragmatist camp, and the camp who other members like Al-Rishk, Mohammed Nazal, those are the three biggest names within the political bureau that are associated with Khaled Mishal, and they're called the so-called pragmatists. Amongst the pragmatists, prior at least to the 2017 elections, there was a thinking that the Arab world, especially Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Egypt, and then outside of the Arab world, Turkey, would be the closest allies for the Islamic Resistance Movement. This was countered by a figure, Al-Zahar. Al-Zahar, Mahmoud Al-Zahar, was always much closer to Iran and had, alongside a few other figures like the aforementioned Marzouk, detracted from the political bureau under Meshal's decision to distance itself from Iran. And in doing so, they formed their own alliances with certain figures within the IRGC and within the broader axis of resistance, always maintaining strong relationships with Hezbollah. Mohammed al-Deif also did this. There's a well-known series of letters between he and Hezbollah after the martyrdom of Mughniya's son, in which he articulates support for Hezbollah. So there were various factions within the Islamic Resistance Movement's political bureau and the facet of the military wing that was undertaking political acts or political linkages. Thus, it should be noted that there did indeed exist this kind of division, but after the 2017 elections, it's broadly thought, and this is something that Paula Caridi's book, which is just titled Hamas, underscores, that after the 2017 elections within Hamas, what transpired was the anchoring of the movement within Gaza. Prior to the Second Intifada, it was actually the Gaza political leadership that was regarded as more pragmatist. Believe it or not, there was a time in which Khaled Meshal was had much stronger ties with Iran than the rest of the Arab world, and was regarded as the opposite of a pragmatist, as a hardliner. He traveled frequently to Iran. After the Syria debacle in 2012, this switched a bit, but with the return of charismatic figures to Gaza, and this was the return of charismatic figures not only like Sinwar, but he was one of the most important charismatic figures who, following the prison exchange deal, had the first important prisoner exchange deal, where a number of charismatic figures returned to Gaza, formed a more, some might call it hardliner, some might call it a more principled camp of political leadership. And so once this took place, you had those who pursued alliances with the axis of resistance, the so-called axis of resistance epitomized by Al-Zahar, Mahmoud Al-Zahar, and Sinwar. Today, Mahmoud Al-Zahar is much older. He's still alive, but he's in the background more so. But there are those like Al-Haddad and Khalil Al-Haya who are at the forefront of the military and political leadership, respectfully.
So okay, so I'm just gonna pause here because this is a good place. We want to continue this trajectory. I like it. I just want to stop and raise a question, which is, you've been focusing almost entirely on the political side of the organization, right? So the political side and the military side are not the same. Obviously, that's not how it works, but that's how it works. But it's more that I'm curious, though, in the midst of all of this, of this changing of this order, the actual brigade, the military part, that the story of Muhammad Daif inside of this trajectory and this inflection point, you called it, in this period, his story inside of all of this. Whereas on the one side, you're talking about kind of a lot of disunity, especially later on in the 2010s when the Syrian crisis pops up. But in the military realm, Muhammad Daif was the opposite. He was a bridge builder. Based on your writings and a little bit some other stuff that I read about him, it seems to be that one of his skills was to be a kind of he would rally around different factions who would otherwise fight each other would manage to sort of come together around this kind of military resistance. Or my way off base here? Because I'm interested in kind of keep going with this sort of study of this inflection point.
Certainly, Muhammad al-Daif was. There are several figures who were unifying figures. Salah al-Arori was another one. I would say many of these unifying figures were those who, with the exception of Daif, were those who immediately preceding the Gilad Shalit deal in October 2011 were freed. It's what translates into the loyalty of the free agreement, where Yahya al-Sinwar, Rahui Mushtaha, Tawfiq Abu Naim, Hussam Badran, who had been a commander within the Al-Qassam brigades in the West Bank and would later form the Hamas Office of National Relations, had spent 14 years in the Zionist entity's prisons and was a cellmate and close friend of Sinwar, were released. So this was a moment in which very important rallying figures were freed. Another important figure is Jihad Yamur, a Hamas operative who had participated in the abduction of the Zionist soldier Nahshon Waxman in 1994 and was released in the Shalit deal. Daif, however, although he did spend a number of years in the prisons actually less than a year in the Zionist entity's prisons, was a long-term consolidating figure indeed, as I noted. So there's this very notable instance. It's in January 2015, 22nd of January 2015, where he sends a condolence letter as a commander-in-chief of the Al-Qassam brigades to Hezbollah's Secretary General, Hassan Nasrallah, for the martyrs of Quneitra. And he calls for the unification of resistance forces against the entity. He had sent this letter after the Quneitra strike that had martyred Jihad Mughniya, which was Imad Mughniya, himself martyred son, and other Hezbollah and Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, members. Multiple outlets had carried the text and the photo of the letter and distributed. And one of the key lines from that letter is when al-Daif says, quote, "The true enemy of the nation is the Zionist enemy, and all rifles must be directed against it. All forces of resistance must direct their coming battle as one," unquote. So I think here we see the rapprochement also prefiguring the Joint Operations Room, as it is later called, and comes to the forefront in the 2021 war, which was not only a joint operations room between the various resistance factions in Gaza, and Palestine more broadly, but also between the so-called axis of resistance, of which Mohammed al-Deif was at the forefront indeed, along with other members, but he played a very important role. Another important figure also is al-Haddad, who is still alive and broadly considered to be the head of Qassam Brigades, the commander-in-chief.
Okay, that was really great. So I think this is a good time to start delving deeper into the timeline of it, because you just brought up like a number of interesting sort of and connected historical points, which was the connection between the prisoners who were released as part of the exchange of prisoners. That's what it is. It's an exchange of prisoners of war during the Gilad Shalit deal. And so that exchange, as you just mentioned, there were fighters who were part of the previous that operation against that first Zionist soldier. So because that seems to be an important moment inside of this history as well, because that's the first time that this happens, right? That this is a new strategy for the Palestinian resistance.
I wouldn't call it a new strategy, because the earliest attempts were actually in the mid-1990s during, or rather very shortly after the end of the First Intifada. Towards the tail end of the First Intifada are when the first operations are taken to so-called kidnap. This is the verbiage that the resistance uses. Some take issue with it when the terminology is used, believing that it is a negative connotation, but this is the terminology they use, and hence it is a terminology I will use. In October 1994, for instance, there is this communique from the Al-Qassam Brigades that's issued where they announce the kidnapping of the Zionist soldier Nachshon Waxman. And this, by the way, is an operation that al-Deif from the background organized. And there's a very good article on the website Metras. Unfortunately, it's not in English, it's in Arabic. But I've also written an article about this very early operation. And in this communique, the reason I mentioned the communique in particular, there is the demand for the release of more than 150 prisoners who are affiliated with the so-called Fazal, the Alliance of Palestinian Forces, who were serving long-term jail sentences for the release of the Zionist soldier. And in addition to the demand of the release of prisoners, 50 of whom belonged to Hamas, 25 of whom belonged to the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, 50 of whom belonged to Al-Fatih or Fatah, 20 to the PFLP, 10 to the DFLP, there were also 20 who were sitting in Zionist jails that belonged to Hezbollah, and 15 that belonged to PFLP-GC, which is the Syria-based offshoot of PFLP. Hamas also demanded the release of Sheikh Yassin and all Palestinian female detainees. This was in their 11 October 1994 communique. The Zionist entity did not release any of them, and this resulted in the death of Waxman. So it, I think, bears underscoring that Waxman and a number of other attempts at prisoner exchange were undertaken before the Gilad Shalit deal. However, as you rightly note, the Gilad Shalit deal was the first very successful undertaking of this method, and therefore it prefigures Tufan al-Aqsa and the methodology of Tufan al-Aqsa. It also does, of course, bear noting that there had been previously, in 1985, a successful undertaking of such an exchange. Sheikh Yassin was released after 11 months in Zionist prison due to a prisoner exchange between the Zionist entity and Ahmed Jibril, who belonged to PFLP-GC, the PFLP General Command, again, the offshoot of the communist Marxist-Leninist PFLP that was and is. It's a bit complicated if we can say they still are. Many of its members still are, but some have left Damascus and Syria more broadly. But at least at this point was anchored in Syria. After his release, Yassin went back to work in 1985, facilitating intelligence efforts of the armed organization called Al-Majd, or Glory, an acronym for what translates into the Organization of Holy War and Preaching. And this was a very important inflection point as well. So I would say that this is an example of when the prisoner exchange was successful, and the reason that the resistance in Palestine began hewing towards these attempts at prisoner exchanges, because it had been successful.
Right. I'm going to mute you. Sorry. So I guess inside of this, though, I want us to think about the actual characters. So maybe you can talk a little bit about Mohammed Dave and his role and his history and all this, because his name, I mean, it's just, you know, when he was martyred and stuff, I had been so used to have this sort of lore around him. And for instance, you know, there was this image of him that he had been survived multiple airstrikes, and he had like missing limbs. He had an eye missing or something, but it was all fake. He was, oh, sorry, my air compressor again. This is a joke, but like you know, there was all like that, this lore picked around this man, but he was just a very capable commander who was able to stay alive against this most violent, you know, military genocidal machine, as it turns out. And so in all of this, I'm curious, Mohammed Dave, his function, his emergence as the leader of the Qassam brigades, because it wasn't just he was the leader, it was that he himself developed the brigades. I mean, is that like these were the founding fathers, not to use a parochial term, but these are the founding fathers, but also the primary constructors of this resistance movement known as Hamas.
He was certainly one of the most important, indeed. I would say he and Sheikh Saleh Shahade were the two leading figures. In 1985, there was, and this is of course before the official formation of Hamas during the beginning of the First Intifada in 1987. But in 1985, Sheikh Saleh Shahade forms what was then called Group Number 44. And Shahade would become a leader of Hamas, and during this period was a member of the Ikhwan, the Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood's own political bureau. And this was one of the first militant cells. This is actually before Al-Daif becomes involved. In between May 1985 and September 1987, there is what becomes known as Al-Mujahidun Al-Filastiyun, which is led by Saleh Shahade, and they carry out military operations against the Zionist entity between 1985 and 1987, the last operation being less than 3 months before the official birth of Hamas on the 14th of December 1987. So Shahade is the co-founder of the Al-Qassam Brigades, a co-founder, and he was the head of it until 2002. He was arrested and he was assassinated in 2002, shortly after he was let out of prison in 2000. But it's in the early 1990s that Al-Daif really becomes one of the leading bastions of the Islamic Resistance Movement when he prepares the aforementioned Nashon Waxman operation, the kidnapping operation of the Zionist occupation soldier who was based in South Lebanon, actually, not in Palestine. But there's also, it should be noted that he inaugurated his resistance career when he joined the Al-Mujahidun Al-Filastiniyu, the Palestinian Mujahideen, as we can translate it, which Sheikh Saleh Shahade had formed and supervised. The Palestinian Mujahideen recruited those who are regarded as the most elite and devoted members of the broader Islamic movement, which at that stage constituted figures who today some are known, some are not so well known. The best known perhaps is Imad Akil. Other members whose names I do think we should underscore because of how important they were, and it is really unfortunate that history books that have been written about Hamas in the West and in English have not given them their due credence, include Yasser al-Nimroti and Jamal Wadi. These two members were also formative of the Palestinian Mujahideen. So there is a very good scholar of the history of Hamas, Mohsen Mohammed Saleh. He directs the Al Zaytuna Center for Research, which publishes on Palestinian political science, etc., but also has published several anthologies on Hamas. And he says that after the formation of what was known as the Palestine apparatus in late 1985, the Palestine apparatus being a political wing associated with the Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood, it took charge of directing action for Palestine at home and abroad. And then the leadership of the Gaza Strip-based formation of the Palestine apparatus, this political formation, agreed in 1986 to officially start military actions. And the military apparatus that had previously existed in scattered cells was rebuilt under the name of the Palestinian Mujahideen. This also, by 1 year, precedes the return of Ahmed Yassin to lead it, which occurs in mid-June 1987. And that's when military action is launched. But returning now to Al-Deif in particular, the most important period of his initial resistance leadership takes place when he forms the military group in the southern Gaza Strip. 2 years after it's established and begins its more clandestine work, the Palestinian Mujahideen, it suffers a severe blow. The Zionist occupation uncovers one of the most important cells, really we can say the most important cell, Cell 101. And that had been responsible for kidnapping 2 occupation soldiers. This was a severe blow. The occupation army launched a widespread campaign of arrests. It affected a large number of the organization's members, including Al-Deif. And at this point, he's sentenced to the occupation's prisons. And it was 2 years. I remember now. I said before it was about a year. It was 2 years in total that he was in prison. So there was a significant period prior to sentencing. During this period, he and Saleh Shahade were deeply affected because they were both imprisoned. And they formed a plan to, as soon as Al-Deif was released from prison, he would form a cell that was dedicated exclusively to kidnapping occupation soldiers and exchanging them for the release of imprisoned Palestinians and Hezbollah Mujahideen. So a few months after his release, Al-Deif resumes fighting, this time under the banner of the Al-Qassam Brigades. He joined the first ranks of the Al-Qassam Brigades that was formed in January 1992. In fact, it was formed by a figure that I mentioned before. One of the figures I noted is not terribly well known in the Western English literature. His name is Yasser al-Nimroti, and he had formed it in January 1992. Now, during this period, Al-Deif, he establishes lines of coordination and communication amongst the Al-Qassam Brigade's military structures in Gaza, the West Bank, and Jerusalem, Al-Quds. At the end of 1993, he returns to the Gaza Strip after forming these linkages. the reason he returns is some very harsh events that unfolded, including the martyrdom of key members of the Qassam brigades, the dismantling of numerous military cells, and the signing of the Oslo Accords, which meant the beginning of the return of the Palestinian Authority to the Gaza Strip. So these developments, because it had for a brief period been formed as a policing unit, left Gaza, and now it was returning again. So these developments marked a new phase in Al-Daif's military career, which began in 1994, when he assumed the position of the military commander of the Qassam brigades in the Gaza Strip. And I can continue talking about what he did after, but I don't want to speak at length too long without letting you speak, so I will be silent for a bit.
No. Keep going. Keep going. I talk a lot on this show. You keep going. This is great.
Okay. So this is a key point. He returns to Gaza. And within a few months...
Actually, okay, I do have one request, though, which is, so something that like that still blows my mind. And I guess because I've known Gaza, the Gaza that I've understood and sort of studied is the era of the siege. So I'm curious, though, is that this guy moves back and forth between the West Bank and Gaza fluidly, right? That's what's something that I didn't know, because, you know, also something that I'm curious about too is that in the midst of all of this resistance, well, I guess we haven't gotten to the West Bank resistance really yet, but the popping up of Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, because that's the Fatah wing, that's the military wing of Fatah. So you would presume that that's one of the more powerful ones, given the fact that Fatah is the most powerful Palestinian political faction. But maybe we can sort of talk a little bit about that. But that's something that I was curious about, him sort of moving back and forth between Gaza and the West Bank. I mean, it's a crazy thought, but of course, this is his homeland. This is where he's from. This is what he knows.
Indeed. It is also, I think, worth noting when you mentioned al-Fatih's presence, that there was a section of the Fatah movement's military wing called the Hawks and the Red Eagle. The Hawks, Sukur Fatah, refers to a Fatah-aligned resistance current that in the 1990s, during the first Intifada, was alongside the so-called Black Panthers, another military current in the northern West Bank. Al-Fad, Al-Aswad emerged during the first Intifada, and they functioned semi-autonomously from the external PLO Fatah leadership, which at that point was based in exile in Tunis. And these prefigured the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade. The Red Eagle group was also a different cadre that was involved in the occupied territories. And these groups were extremely close to some of the cells, including the 101 group, that Qassam, or prefigured Qassam. They all attended Imad Aql's funeral, which was a very important occurrence. So there were close relationships indeed between these factions. It also bears noting that indeed travel was more fluid during this time. There were not as many, by any degree, as many checkpoints. This is partially because until the 2005, until 2005, when the Zionist entity leaves Gaza, officially leaves Gaza and encircles it, it was much easier, particularly during the late 1990s and early 2000s, for figures, including resistance figures, to travel in between the 1948 Palestine and in between Gaza, therefore going to Al-Quds, to Jerusalem, and going to the West Bank. This happened often. Now, it wasn't all done under the auspices of legal maneuvering. There were many figures, including Imad Aql, including Muhammad al-Daif, who would dress like Jewish settlers, and they would use this as a way to travel freely. sometimes even blaring Hebrew music. A number of them learned Hebrew and were able to speak to the checkpoint guards in Hebrew. So there were still resistance techniques that were used for travel, but it was done quite commonly for figures like Imad Aql and Muhammad al-Dayf and Saleh Shehadeh.
Okay, thank you for that. That was very edifying. Oh, sorry, more noise. So, maybe we can kind of think through this next moment, Rumi, because it's interesting in the midst of all of this. So, in these early moments, right, and then when you have these, let's say, nascent military resistance project, then you have this incredibly game-changing moment or watershed moment, whatever, which is the signing of the Oslo Accords. To my view, and I've always kind of expressed it this way, is that the Oslo Accords inaugurates a moment where a faction or a portion or a wing, let's say, of the Palestinian National Liberation Movement begins its capitulation. Now, I know you've written about how there were different schools of thinking around this, around the agreement, that some believe that there were some that believe that, okay, Arafat is doing what he can to kind of maneuver his way, and then the time will come where you do uno reverso and, you know, you don't capitulate. But looking back now, and you realize that, yeah, whatever happened to Yasser Arafat, sorry, it's very loud. I'm pretty sure my car contractor is doing this on purpose to spite me because he's mad at me, but that's okay. Thank you. I think he's just making noise. I was thinking is that, like, in this moment where you have, imagine you're Muhammad Dayf, or, you know, you're part of this resistance movement, and you are watching part of your ruling elite of your society sign away the land, right? Like, that's what, at least some, I mean, Edward Said famously called it the Palestinian Versailles. So it wasn't just like resistance figures. It wasn't just like a thing inside there, that the Oslo Accords represented a very controversial step among the Palestinian ruling elite. And when you learn about now, especially more recently, it came out that the freaking Norwegians who were doing it are fucking Epstein freaks. That, like, oh, that this was like a trap of like historical proportions, that, you know, that part of the Palestinian ruling elite that, you know, signed away and then continued to sign away and have continued to do so in the midst of like the worst genocide, insofar as that you have basically this you have this comprador force that are, you know, that have arms, that have extensive arms training, that have a militant wing, but that militant wing is in the service of ensuring no Palestinians resist Zionist expansion, at least more or less, and also, you know, enforcing the ruling class you know, order of things in the West Bank and the remaining parts of the West Bank that are functionally under PA control. It's so that I'm interested in about. And imagine you're seeing that happen in front of your eyes. This incredibly powerful, and so we hear all of, like, the lore that we got over here from the media. And I don't know how old you are, but I remember when they signed those accords. That handshake was on every TV screen for like what seemed like months, right? Like, they gave them the Nobel Peace Prize. Like, there was a whole psyop built into that to convince the world that, oh, we've nipped this Palestine thing in the bud. And of course, you look back at the preceding 3 decades, like the 3 decades since, or the aftermath of those 3 decades since, and you're like, oh, it was all just a freaking trap, and they never meant it. They were never going to sign away what they think of as Greater Israel. And so why Palestinians did that is, you know, a question. And of course, there's lots of, I think the most recent, like, pretty good explanation, at least from my view, I'm not the expert, but there's probably better ones. But one way is Rashid Khalidi's book, The 100 Years War on Palestine. And basically, he made this argument that none of the individual actors who were involved in the composition of these accords were in any position to understand what they were doing, because they were largely disconnected from the homeland. And so you have this kind of diaspora class sweeping in to make these incredibly radical changes to the status quo after the Intifada, and what could be called the kind of, you know, and then so in the midst of all this, you know, you have this story. And then a little bit later, maybe it's too soon to jump into that, you have the outbreak of the Al-Aqsa Intifada, you know, in the West Bank too, right? Not just, that's not a Gaza thing, that's a West Bank thing. So so I'm just curious in all of this to think about if we can kind of detangle these things.
Sure. So what I think is one of the most important points in the beginning of the process of Fatah's capitulation is the so-called Madrid Peace Conference. And this takes place in the period between October 30th and November 1st of 1991. It's also notably the period in which tensions between the PLO and Hamas transpire. So before this, in April 1990, the PLO had extended an invitation to Hamas to engage in the process of preparing to enter the PLO. It was called the Preparatory Committee, and it was aimed at restructuring the PNC, the Palestinian National Committee. But in July of that year, so a few months later, the PLO's official organ, Filastin al-Thawra, releases a statement where they accuse Hamas of abandoning the cause of Palestinian unity. So why had this happened? Because Hamas had articulated that in order to enter the PLO, they would require that the way that the PLO functions would have to be restructured such that it would be not based on demography, but instead based on a more democratic electoral system. There was also a number of demands that were made concerning any potential negotiations that any PLO member or the PLO body as a whole would undertake if they were to negotiate with the occupation. One of these was regarding the entirety of occupied Palestine as Waqf. This term, W-A-Q-F, Waqf, it's an Islamic term, but it really means that nobody has, what it translates into in terms of meaning means nobody has, no one actor or party has the ability to exchange any parcel of Palestinian homeland to the occupation in negotiating. Essentially, all of Palestine belongs to Palestinians. So these demands were not ones that Arafat and the PLO leadership were willing to assent to. Due to this, tensions rose, while the PLO never abrogated with their demands on Hamas. They increasingly, in fact, began to meet in private with the occupation. And this sort of before the proper Oslo period comes to a fore with the Madrid conference. So during the Madrid conference, there's a delegation, a joint delegation, because Fatah is not allowed to represent Palestine. So it has to work with a joint delegation of Jordanian leadership, as is a demand put on it. And so this joint Palestinian-Jordanian delegation works in consultation with the exiled PLO leadership in Tunis. As you say, Al-Khalidi, he notes that there is a disconnection. Well, this disconnection is primarily due to this Tunis-based leadership. Now, when one reads, for instance, Clayton Swisher's 2011, The Palestine Papers, or reads the Palestine Papers that were released via, I believe, WikiLeaks, and then hosted on Al Jazeera's website, they do get a sense that much of what was being undertaken by Fatah in terms of capitulation was witting. There was not only knowledge of this not being necessarily representative, but also very vituperative remarks that were made in terms of the more principled camps within all of the political parties. So it seems there was an intentional misrepresentation. Whether their telos, the telos that they were undertaking, was that of a better state of affairs for the Palestinian people or not? I don't think we can argue with what was in their minds, but in de facto terms, it resulted in the abdication of the main branches of the Fatah resistance. Of course, then you have offshoot wings that to this day are part of the joint operations room with Al-Qassam, Saraya al-Quds, and the other resistance factions.
Sorry, it's more noise. So, no, thank you for that. That's interesting. So I'm curious, Hamas has to confront in the mid 2000s. Hamas and Fatah reach in the form of the PA, but it's Fatah because Fatah controls the PA by this time, and I think it always has, in effect. And I'm curious though, is that there is itself a kind of climax in Gaza, right? Where it's not just like tensions, but it's straight up, they had like street battles and Fatah lost. And in addition to being democratically booted out by the people of Gaza themselves. I mean, Palestinians, this is something that I always stress, is that, yeah, Palestinians, Gaza had probably one of the more advanced Arab democracies until it was destroyed. And 2005 was proof that that people, given the opportunity and given a competent political actor, which wasn't just like an alliance of ruling class thugs, which actually had a foothold in society as a movement, a social movement, right? That's the Harakat, right? Like that's what Hamas stands for, Harakat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya, right? Hamas, right? Yeah. And it's like the Islamic Resistance Movement. And so this movement defeated what was a kind of ossified, at least even less though by then, fossilized, ruling class that was clearly willing to hand over Palestine to Zionists in exchange for some of the crumbs that compradors do. I mean, this is not unique in the history of colonization. I mean, this is where there are stories like this out of what's now called North America, where you had the rival indigenous sort of political factions facing up against each other, and one party, emboldened by imperialists and aided and abetted by imperialists and helping their own project, were able to swing pressure, were able to sort of win over more, say, principled forces who weren't willing to give up what, say, other actors were. I mean, this is not unique to Palestine, this story. That this is something that all indigenous societies facing colonizations have to confront, where you're handed something, you say, you like this carrot, here's this carrot of recognition, we'll give you something, we'll give some little crumbs to your ruling class, and in exchange you're going to give us away your future. That's not this is not unique, but something interesting in all this is that you have two geographic locales in this. When after the defeat and the expulsion of that comprador wing of the Palestinian movement, Fatah, and the rise of the more principled movement in Gaza, and then the response, this now represents a ratcheting up of the colonizers' logic, right? So then siege kicks in, checkpoints all over. I mean, this is also in the aftermath of the Al-Aqsa Intifada, where Zionists were unable to stop, the martyrdom operations that caused so much fear and panic in their society, that return to them what they are supposed to be the masters of against their enemies, which is that feeling of insecurity. So this story of the mid 90s, and then I'm curious if we can sort of zoom in on this time, because this itself has its own climax in the Al-Aqsa Intifada, right? Where Palestinians themselves decided in the West Bank that, okay, that this Oslo deal isn't working out for us. We're going to do something about it. We don't accept this.
Yes, so there are several points here to be made. I think one of the most important concerns the democratic nature of Hamas and really before that, of the Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood in general, which, by the way, I would note here, I'm sure some listeners have an antipathy to the Muslim Brotherhood as a whole. I understand why, considering some of the collaborationist nature of the various Muslim Brotherhood wings, some in Syria, for instance, others in Tunisia. But there is no such thing. I say this often. I say it to my students. There is no such thing as the Muslim Brotherhood as such. There are Muslim Brotherhoods. Some of these Muslim Brotherhoods have very distinct histories. And the Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood, which after a certain point asked for autonomy from the broader Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, is part of what's called the Al-Banna school of the Muslim Brotherhood, named after Hassan al-Banna. And this is it has its own political history, its own literary and Islamic theological context. Its literature, for instance, is very distinct from that which, for instance, the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood engages with, though there are shared texts as well, and there are shared scholars, and even within the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, there are various factions. So it's very much an oversimplification to demonize the Muslim Brotherhood and the various Muslim Brotherhoods as such. Many don't know that before Fatah, the formative figures, including figures like Abu Jihad, were members of the Muslim Brotherhood, the Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood. Even Arafat at one point was rumored to be a member of the Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood. They were the only faction during the Nakba who waged war successfully on behalf of the Palestinian people amongst the Arab countries, and they were valiant in their battles, and this was what attracted many to them because they were a genuine resistance organization. Now, it's true that after a period, there is a mosque building phase, a more political pragmatist phase, but I just mentioned this to note that to understand the democratic current that the Hamas movement follows, one must appreciate that well before the Palestinian Ikhwan, or Muslim Brotherhood, Ikhwan just meaning brother, became Hamas, or rather a segment of it became Hamas in 1987, it participated in campaigns to elect officers of student unions at colleges and universities. It also engaged in such electoral campaigns in higher learning institutions like trade schools. In the 1950s and 1960s, the Ikhwan in the West Bank regularly contested parliamentary elections, and it capitalized on, back then, what was a relative tolerance that was displayed towards them by the Jordanians and the Jordanian government. It won significant seats in the Jordanian parliament that represented Palestinian cities like Hebron and Nablus in the 1950s, particularly in 1954, 56, and then in the 1962 elections. I won't go through the entire electoral history of the Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood, but in 1978, the Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood merges with the Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan, and it forms a unified organization called Bilad al-Sham. And that's when it begins to focus on social institution building, mosques, charities, universities, medical services. And then the Palestinian Ikhwan introduces, or rather reintroduces, internal elections in Palestine at some points in the late 1970s and then early 1980s. Then in the 2000s, this Bilad al-Sham organization, the Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood, members within it, because it does still continue as an autonomous organization from Hamas after 1987, they ask the office in Egypt, the nexus of the Muslim Brotherhood, for autonomy. And today, the Muslim Brotherhood that exists in Palestine, specifically in Gaza, as it is persecuted in the West Bank by the PA, although they do win elections in PA universities when they're allowed to run, usually they run under unity tickets with Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which, although it doesn't participate in the Palestinian legislative, the Committee or the PNA, the Palestinian National Association, it doesn't participate in these elections. The PIJ does participate in local municipal seats in the form of these unity tickets. Something that PA propagandists will often say is that, look, we are the more popular, Fatah is more popular because we win all of the student elections in the West Bank. But this is only the case when the Islamic bloc is persecuted and not allowed to participate. When they are allowed to participate, as we see in numerous university elections over the last 5 years, they oftentimes do win. Now, putting this to the side, in the actual history of Hamas proper, not the Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood, there are very important electoral successes. Now, in June 1996, there's a process where the PA tries to split Hamas by encouraging some of its members to form an independent Islamic political party that would attract so-called religious elements to form Hamas itself and its supporters, but other members would split off, and this party could share power with the PA. What was exhorted was for some Hamas members to put up candidates for elections organized by the PA in accordance with the Oslo Agreement. And 3 Islamic parties, the National Islamic Path Party, the National Islamic Union Party, and the National Islamic Salvation Party, are then formed, most of whose members were former members or close associates of Hamas. So there is at this point already an attempt to form political parties. The best known of these is the Islamic Salvation Party, which was an Islamic front, Islamic political party, but it didn't really participate in the elections. It just formed in November 1995. The Islamic National Salvation Party is established by Hamas and it's dismantled in 2000, but it was represented in the Palestinian National Council, the PNC. This party, which was known as Al-Khalas, it participated in 2009 by representing 2 members who were initially members of Hamas, Yahya Musa, who held a role in the political bureau, and the party spokesperson and political bureau member Ghazi Hamad, both of whom were later Hamas MPs in the 2000 PLC election. So this INSP, as it was abbreviated, Islamic National Salvation Party, was proposed to create a middle ground between the principles of Hamas as a resistance movement and political reality created by the Oslo process. They didn't want to reject the ability to represent the Islamic movement when elections were held, but also they didn't want to validate the abrogation of Palestinian rights to the concession framework that Fatah was following. So there were many internal debates. Eventually, it is decided that they will not participate in the mid-90s in this set of elections. In fact, Mahmoud al-Zahar, who I mentioned as a representative of the more axis of resistance faction, prefiguring in many ways the ethos and ideology that is today best associated with al-Sinwar and al-Haya, he had been the spokesperson for Hamas inside the occupied territories during the period between 1994 and 1996, and he supported taking part in these elections. He even wrote to Khalid Hrub in March 1996 saying, "My personal opinion differs from the opinion of the movement, but I don't want to state it." So in a politically minded sense, diplomatic sense, he here notes that he thinks that they should have participated in the elections. In fact, Sheikh Yassin was also in favor of participating, as was Abu Marzouk, but Khalid Meshal thought that they should be principled and reject the Oslo process as such and not participate. Other members agreed. So again, this is representative that Khalid Meshal, although today a political pragmatist, was during this period regarded as a principlist of sorts. In any case, so the decision is made not to participate in this set of elections. Although Mahmoud al-Zahar publishes a very important policy paper of sorts after undertaking polls of different regions in which it's demonstrated that if Hamas were to participate, they would win. They would win a lot of seats, in fact. This was done very systematically. So then, in the period between December 2004 and December 2005, there are 4 rounds of municipal elections, local elections. Overall, Hamas, or rather the lists that Hamas supported at the municipal level, clan affiliations being predominant in who is put forwards and alliances with non-members of the Islamic bloc, win a third of the seats. This again demonstrates that how strong support for Hamas is and the democratic nature of the Islamic resistance movements. In December, there's this first round that's held in West Bank and Gaza, and on the 23rd of December in 2004, there's 26 districts in the West Bank and that are and on the 27th of January in 2005, 10 districts in Gaza. These are the first local elections in the occupied territories in over 30 years, and Hamas does very well in both rounds. By the fall of 2005, Hamas is in the majority control of many local councils, with access to Gaza and to a lesser extent the West Bank's institutional infrastructure and then the constituencies therein. So I only emphasize this because before getting to the 2006 elections, I think it's very important to understand that alongside the social and civil services that are erected in the occupied territories by the Hamas movement, there is also a genuinely democratic participation in the political infrastructure while trying to balance this without being conciliatory to the Oslo process.